Welcome back to the Property Pilot. So today we're talking about, should you invest in a house or a flat? So welcome back. Today we're talking about, should you invest in a flat or a house? It's a really good question that I get asked a lot. Now we're going to break down, essentially what is a house and what is a flat, and then we're going to talk about the pros and cons of each of them. And by the end of this video, hopefully you've worked out which is best for you. There's no right or wrong. It's just whatever suits you, your strategy, and what your preference actually is. And we'll come on to that very shortly.
Okay, so to talk about flats and houses a bit more, we need to understand freehold versus leasehold. These are really important things to understand. So without further ado, a freehold is where you own the property and you own the ground. You own absolutely everything. Now, typically, I'd say the majority of houses, probably 99% plus of houses, are freehold. There are some weird exceptions where there are leasehold properties, and typically these actually tend to be let on a long lease. So even though they're technically leasehold, some people view them as freehold because you're paying a peppercorn rent of £1 and there's 900 odd years left on the lease. So freehold is great. Let's come on to leasehold. Leasehold, every flat you see will most likely be a leasehold type of property. And what this means is, you don't own the ground, but you own the flat for a certain number of years, depending on how many years are left on that lease. So let's just say, I don't know, there are 125 years left on this lease. It's an apartment in the city centre. So, that lease says, this apartment is mine for 125 years, but after that, it's no longer mine, okay? And you don't own the ground. So you're essentially just kind of leasing it off the freeholder who owns the ground and owns that building. I hope that makes sense. But this is the difference between freehold and leasehold. In a nutshell, freehold is a lot simpler, it's a lot easier to deal with, and there are less issues that crop up. Leasehold, there's a bit more to it. You have to obtain permissions from the freeholder. And I'm going to go into the positives and the negatives of this very, very shortly. So let's get back to the office and explore this in a bit more detail.
Okay, so there are two more things we need to talk about when thinking about leasehold properties, and this is ground rent and service charge. So the ground rent is the rent that you pay to the freeholder, the person that owns the ground, so every single year. So, for example, a property could have a £250 ground rent, and you're paying that £250 every single year to the freeholder. Now, sometimes obviously you don't pay this direct to the freeholder, you'll pay it to the block agent, who then will pay it to the freeholder, okay? So, you'll be paying this on an annual basis for ground rent, essentially for, the rent for the ground of which the property lies upon. Next thing, let's talk about the service charge. So a service charge is essentially a 6 monthly or annual fee that you pay the block agent for the services. So for example, let's say you've got 30 units in a block, all the windows need cleaned, all the insurance needs arranging for the block, and maybe certain maintenance needs to be carried out. So all those costs, once you add them together, divide them by the 30 units, and let's assume you own one of those 30 units, and you pay that 1/30th share of the service charge. And of course the block agent who manages this block is they could charge a fee for their services that they do to actually manage this block. So it's really important you think about ground rent and you think about service charge when assessing the viability of a flat or an apartment. Now, there are some lenders out there that are quite strict when it comes to ground rent and service charge. So if the ground rent and service charge is above a certain percentage of the purchase price that you've agreed on this flat, they will not lend, or they'll lend on slightly different terms for this particular flat and for this particular property. So you need to make sure really that the flat has reasonable ground rent and reasonable service charges to ensure that you're getting good access to good lenders at good rates. And again, speak to your mortgage broker. If your ground rent and service charge is a bit high, there are lenders that are willing to consider lending on this. Okay, it's not the end of the world. You just may have to pay a slight premium for this. So a little tip here: ground rent. Watch out in the lease the details of and the terms of this ground rent. What you don't want is for this ground rent to double every 10 years. You want to make sure that there are reviews to realistically assess this ground rate and to ensure it does not spiral out of control. Now, service charge, again, I can make a whole different video on service charges. There's so much to think about in terms of the service charge. But what we're trying to say here is, we want to ensure that we're budgeting for this service charge, right? We don't want a nasty surprise bill, a really high service charge, maybe a one-off year, something's gone really wrong, a new lift needs putting in the building, and of course that's going to be shared between all the leaseholds and all the flats in that particular particular building. So service charge again is a really contentious topic, and especially if your flat or the building has problems, maybe it's got cladding issues, again the service charge could be quite high because first of all you may have a waking watch, you may have people that are stationed in that building 24/7 to ensure that the property is safe and there's no fire risk, or minimising the fire risk where as far as possible, or maybe you actually have to contribute towards the remedial works required to make the cladding safe, okay, and to do any compartmentation works if required. So let's move on a bit here. Again, I will make another video, a more detailed video about service charge in the future. So this really comes down to three things, in my opinion anyway, flat or house. It comes down to three things. The first is strategy. What actually is your strategy? A lot of people, like to buy city centre flats because they are rented out easier, and they don't want to spend that much time in their property portfolio. They want to give it to an agent, they want to spend as minimal time as possible, they want to buy some nice city centre flats that will rent out nice and easy, and they're not going to be making or maximising their income on a monthly basis, but maybe the capital value and the appreciation of those flats over the long term is going to be higher than average. Another thing we need to think about is preference, and I've already alluded to in the previous example. Some people prefer to buy leaseholds because they're seen as nicer flats, whereas others, myself included, prefer to buy freehold. And the reason why I prefer to buy freehold is generally there's less faff, there's less stress, there's less hassle, and there's less risk, okay? So, and I'll come on to this very shortly in the pros and cons of houses versus flats, so preference plays a big role as well. And lastly, location. Some investors only invest in specific locations, and if your location is London, well, good luck getting a freehold property, right? You will be investing in leasehold properties, in flats and in apartments, whereas other investors like to invest in certain towns, and in those towns there are lots of freehold properties to choose from. So to summarize this point, strategy, preference and location do play a big role in determining whether you want to buy a house or a flat. Now let's move on to the pros and the positives of buying a house. So first of all, you have more control as it's a freehold property. So as a freehold property there are less restrictions over what you can and cannot do compared to a leasehold property. A leasehold property, you may need to obtain permission from the freeholder to do anything, extensions, any works, things of that nature. So with a freehold property, with a house, there is much more control. Another reason why people prefer to buy houses is because typically speaking, the tenancies and the tenants that stay in houses stay there longer than the tenants that stay in flats. Now, I actually think this can be a negative point. A lot of people see this as a positive because they can let their property out for 5, 6, 7 years, because people tend to stay in houses longer, especially if they're families. But there is a big negative to this, right? I prefer to maintain my properties in a more timely manner and to ensure things are really kept in tip-top shape. And sometimes when you've got a tenant in there for 7 years, it's difficult to do. Whereas if you've got a tenant that's maybe turning over every 2 or 3 years, that gives you a great excuse to get into the property, get it back to the standard that it used to be in. And there's benefits of doing that, because if you're actually properly maintaining and enhancing your property, you can command a higher rent. Whereas if you've got tenants in your property for the long term, that rent may not be as high as what you can actually charge for, because it's harder to maintain a property and to add value to a property whilst people are in the property. It's harder to do work to the kitchen and the bathrooms and things like that, or decorating when people live in a property. It's just very hard to actually do that. You don't want to disturb them, and you want to make sure that they're living in this property and not smelling paint, and you can actually use the bathroom and you can use the kitchen and have their own privacy. Okay, another positive of a house is there's a lot more scope to add value, and I've already alluded upon this point. If you've got a leasehold flat, you need to get the freeholder's permission to do an extension. Now, can you actually extend the flat? I've actually extended the flat before, but that's because I own the freehold. But can you extend most flats? Well, no, because you've got no space to extend into, right? Of course, you could maybe, if you've got a top floor flat, you can maybe see if you can go up it ever slightly further. But again, the odds and risk of doing this are quite high, and you need to get permission from the freeholder. Whereas if you've got a house, then you don't need to get any permissions. You can do it. There's a lot more scope to add value, so you can do extensions. You can refurb the property. Of course, you can refurb the flat, but there's less things you need to worry about when you're refurbing a house. And there's lots of ways to add value in a freehold house compared to a flat. Okay, another positive of a house, you may get the theme here, there are a lot of positives of buying a house and buying a freehold property, is banks and lenders see it as less risk. And again, so do I see a freehold property as less risk. There's only so much really that can go wrong with a freehold property. Whereas in a leasehold property, again, say you've got 30 units in this development, well, a lot of things can go wrong. You can't control really that much. If you've got one of those 30 leases, again, your say is really minimal. There's only so much you can influence as one 1/30 share. So houses are seen as less risk. Another little plus before we come on to flats in regards to housing is things like gardens and things like parking and garages. You know, these things you may think aren't that important, but actually when you're letting a property to tenants, they see this as incredibly important. You know, families with pets, for example, will require a garden or most likely require a garden. Again, some people find it imperative that they have parking, whether off or on street at a property. And again, things like garages, you know, people want to safely secure the things like motorbikes, tools, and things of that nature. Okay, so you know, typically flats don't come with that, and that's why, you know, maybe you can command a slight premium when you're renting out this property because it comes with parking, it comes with garages, or it comes with a garden, or maybe, you know, just one or two of those. So let's move on to the negatives of buying a house and buying a freehold property. Well, all the maintenance falls on you. A lot of people see this as a negative way, so you know, you're responsible and liable for all the costs incurred for this freehold property, right? But I see it as a positive. I'd much more have complete control over a freehold property and complete control over the costs than have, you know, not so much influence in a leasehold development. So I hope that point makes sense. Now, in terms of another negative of a house, generally speaking, this isn't for the north of the UK, but more for the south, a house will cost more than a flat in the south of the UK, and therefore it may, you know, restrict people getting into property because they can only afford to purchase a flat rather than a house. So that's the negative of the house. So the purchase price is typically more than a flat, especially in the south of the UK. In the north, that's not true. You can actually buy houses cheaper than flats in the north, okay, which is absolutely great. Okay, so let's come on to flats. There are some significant positives to buying to flats and buying leasehold properties. And flats are typically seen as more attractive tenanted investment. Tenants would rather move into a nice flat than move into a home. It's far easier to actually let out a nice city centre flat than it is, you know, a freehold property. Don't get me wrong, it still can be incredibly simple to let a freehold house out, don't get me wrong, that's, you know, providing it's done to the right standard, but there are typically a lot more people seeking a nice flat than a house. So it will take you less time to let a property out, to let this flat out, and typically flats tend to be newer than houses, okay? Think of all these city centre developments. They're not actually that old, most of them maybe 20, 30 years old. Whereas think of the average age of a house. A house can easily be, you know, 1800s, you know, early 1900s. And, you know, some people prefer to live in newer style accommodation, which is a massive tick in the box for flats. You know, as I've already alluded to, flats generally cost less than houses in the south of the UK, but, you know, maybe in the north, that's not necessarily the case. So that's the advantage of buying a flat in the south. You know, it is cheaper than buying a house. Another plus for buying flats is there is less work for you to arrange and organise, okay? Because the block agent will arrange for this work, you know, and arrange for this maintenance themselves. Of course, you're going to have to pay them to do that job. But again, if you're worried about organising and maintaining maintenance of the communal areas and things of that nature, well, you don't have to do that. That falls upon the block agent. Again, sometimes I see this as a negative. I'd much rather do it myself and ensure it's done correctly and have full control than give it to someone else and it may or may not be done. Everyone has their own take on that. So let's move on to the negatives of flats, which we've already addressed really by talking about the positives of houses. And that's obviously you have less control because it's a leasehold property. You have less control and less influence over the development. So, you know, you have to converse and communicate with the block agent and with the freeholder to get things done. And it's ultimately up to them, and they can choose, you know, if they want to get that done, you know, and maybe it's not to your liking. You know, maybe they want to delay something, or they've chosen not to upgrade a system where, you know, you and other leaseholders that have requested this upgrade or this fix or this maintenance issue be completed. Another point I've already alluded to, you have to pay for the block agent, okay? So, you know, they will charge a professional fee within the service charge that you have to pay for. Okay, another biggie which I alluded to is unexpected bills, which you'll see in the service charges. And this can be things like cladding, you know, to fix cladding. Again, if you don't qualify for any government funding, then, you know, you're going to have to fork out yourself to fix that cladding. And as it stands, in the north of the UK, for properties that are less than £175,000, you'll have to contribute £10,000 towards the fix of the cladding and any remedial works or compartmentation works identified as a result of the survey. Now, again, don't quote me on this. This is just what the law says today, but it can change at any point, as we're seeing. There's always new things about cladding and leaseholder rights and what leaseholders are expected to contribute depending on the value of the property and the criteria if they're considered qualified leaseholders. Again, Google this, you can find much more information about this. Okay, another thing that a negative about flats is the mortgageability of flats. Again, you know, something could happen. For example, this cladding issue, which means a flat is no longer mortgageable. So let's say you purchase this flat with a mortgage and your fixed term is coming up for expiry very shortly. And in fact, you're struggling to remortgage this property because cladding issues have been identified, which means lenders are no longer willing to lend on the property. Okay, you could be stuck and, you know, you may have to put in the cash to actually pay off that mortgage, or you could be stuck on the variable rate for longer than what you want to be stuck on. As I've already alluded to, again, you need to seek permission from the freeholder for certain things that you want to do to your flat, which again again, they could say no, or it could take a lot of time to do this, or it actually they could require money for you to do whatever you want to do. Okay, so that's why I like buying a freehold property, because you have complete control. Okay, lastly, we've already spoken about this, parking and things of that nature. Negative of flats is they often do not come with parking. Flats that do come with parking are absolutely great because they can command a premium. And again, generally you don't have gardens and garages and things of that nature with flats. But if you do have gardens, maybe a rooftop terrace in a flat, again, another great way of commanding a premium when you're letting it out to tenants, and it will make it far more attractive when you're letting it out. So again, we've spoken about a lot of things in this video. We've gone over the pros and cons of houses and freehold properties and flats and leaseholds. So I hope you really understand the pros and cons to each, and really it comes down to your strategy, your preference and location. So I'd really like to hear your opinion. What do you prefer? Do you prefer to invest in houses, or do you prefer to invest in flats? Typically me, I prefer to invest in houses, but saying that, I do have flats, I have leasehold flats, and I have a block of freehold flats as well. But for me, houses are a lot more easier, they're less stress, they're less hassle, and there's far more certainty and more control, which I like as an investor. But if the price is right, do consider purchasing a flat, purchasing a leasehold. So I hope you've really got value from today's video. Let me know if I've missed out anything, or if there's anything that you think is worth talking about in the comments, and maybe I'll do another video about that. So if you haven't already subscribed to my channel, I really kindly request that you consider subscribing. YouTube tells me the majority of people watching this channel are not subscribed. So as you know, I'm giving away a free flight once we hit 10,000 subscribers. I'll be choosing one lucky subscriber at random. We'll be flying over Yorkshire together in the aircraft, having an amazing time. So help me grow this channel, and I'll help you by taking on you on a flight that you will never forget. So thanks very much for watching, and enjoy your day.